me just check audio levels and things. Alright, they seem to be okay. Can someone confirm in the chat that the Shire cozy maxing music is at a good level and that you can hear me? There he is. Thank you. Yeah, can someone just confirm that you can hear me, and then and that the cool can confirm. Very nice. Yeah. What should I chat about before more people get in here? Not a lot to talk about. It's Christmas. It's cold in the UK. My heating's not very good. Just has to be on all the time. So yeah. I've got a fair few questions from the Patreon and from the Discord, so I've got some questions. But be sure to put all your questions in the chat, and then I'll answer anything. That person, 8 beautiful 8 golden 8 dragon 8, you ask every time about Bob Dobbs, which makes me think that you probably are Bob. Hey Bob, how's it going, man? I miss you. Well, I can begin with that question. When's Bob Dobbs' Christmas special? I haven't had the energy to, be ready for such a thing, because I know it's going to go on. The next Bob talk I do, I want it to be, at minimum, 36 hours long. And, yeah, the McLuhan rabbit hole is deep. I'll give it one more minute here, but I guess I'll begin by saying Merry Christmas to everyone. The joyous, lovely season. It's very cozy. Yeah, Merry Christmas, everyone, and I hope you're all having a good Christmas and the world isn't treating you too badly. Thanks for all your support, and thanks for listening throughout another year, another full-time year. The first full-time year living on my own in the new apartment, which has been joyous and, yeah, nice. So thanks for everyone who supported and who continues to support. So, fair few people watching, fair few people listening, thanks very much. Let's begin with these questions. When's Bob Dobbs' Christmas special? Might as well, yeah, I'll begin there again. Yeah, I'd like to do another special, Bob. I'll probably say the same thing that I've said every time, which has been about a year of me saying this now. Is I'm just not ready. I haven't really read. I haven't read enough McLuhan beyond what me and Bob were talking about before, and McLuhan goes off in 1,001 directions that I want to have a grasp of the other areas before I do that. So I'm ready, and hopefully when we do that, we're going to do it with a guy Cameron as well. So. That should be good. So the questions which are coming in from the Patreon and the Discord, the first one was, any thoughts on magical idealism? I actually had to look this up. So this is to do with Hölderlin, I believe, the poet Hölderlin, who believed that philosophy and poetry should be connected, or magical idealism is that poetry and philosophy are on the same level or work in the same way or something. And I think if my understanding of it is right, of my very quick glance of it, then sure, it seems fine, but it would be a problem of definitions of what's poetry? Poetry is the thing which really taps into the outside when it's done right. In that latest, I'll probably mention him 1,000 times in this Q&A, but in one of the latest Cormac McCarthy interviews, he says, does anyone really believe we're doing poetry anymore? Which I think is a sort of a poignant comment from him. Whether or not it's true, I don't know. But I don't know enough about magical idealism to really make too much of a comment. The next question was thoughts on D&G, which I assume is Deleuze and Guattari, not Dolce and Gabbana. But my thoughts on Deleuze and Guattari, is I've mentioned this a few times, and other people always mention this, that a lot of the time when people talk about Deleuze, they actually are just talking about Deleuze and Guattari. They're talking about that madness that comes in with the Deleuze-Guattarian philosophy, right? And the impression I get, so when you read Deleuze, and I'm talking specifically about Deleuze, when you read Deleuze, you're getting very much a philosopher's philosopher. You're sitting down, you're reading him comment on other philosophers, Spinoza, Bergson, etc., his books on them, his monographs on them, and you're getting a philosopher's philosopher. It's very difficult stuff, especially difference from repetition. But so when a lot of people talk about Deleuze, they tend to sort of hint a little bit at Deleuze and Guattari. And when you're talking about Deleuze and Guattari, it's like sitting down and having, and this is for me personally, it's like having a big junk food meal that the juvenile part of you is like, oh man, I can't wait to do this, like nomads, and all the, nomadism and line of flight and all these schizoanalysis and all this absolutely bleeding edge of schizo theory, almost in a way accelerative philosophy, and it's super cool. But then at the end of this junk food meal, you sort of man, I'm exhausted and I don't really know what to do with any of the energy that I just took in. There's 1,001 ideas hitting you, and I always really struggled to really do anything with the ideas that Deleuze and Guattari sort of put forth in them things. And a lot of people just use them. They take something and they'll go off and do something about nomadism or the war machine or something like that. But my thoughts on D&G is it's extremely fun, and it's like the amphetamine hyperactivity of philosophy, and it's fun every now and again, but you can't really, it's like you can't eat junk food all the time, and I don't want to call them junk philosophers, definitely not, but it's sort of like the coffee, cigarette and amphetamine equivalent of philosophy, and you can't do that all the time. You either get burnt out or you just go a bit doolally, really. But as you progress through Deleuze and Guattari's works, one, from my understanding from reading the big biography of Deleuze and Guattari together, and from reading as much biographical material as I have read around them, the influence and the actual productive input in those works from Guattari becomes less, and you actually realize once you get to what is philosophy, you're almost reading a Deleuzean work, to be honest. And I haven't read much of Guattari's solo work. So I'll switch to the questions in the chat so I don't miss them. Is an episode on René Guénon in the works? If not, please do it. I read a book the other day by Robin Waterfield about Guénon, and it was really it was a great introduction. I've been struggling for a while to find someone to talk about Guénon, because he's one of these figures, much like Ludwig Klages actually, who they misconceive the philosophy and they drag him into something else. So with Guénon, you have a lot of the traditionalists, and then he sometimes gets dragged into the right. He sometimes gets dragged all over the place. And that the book by, I think his name's Robin Waterfield, was really good introduction of what Guénon was trying to do. It's a very intellectual work, obviously perennialist. I'd love to do an episode on him, but I need to read more Guénon. And also with Guénon, what that book emphasizes, a lot of people you have that now sort of infamous set of Guénon, like that one publisher has done every single book as a small hardback, in terms of the same style with the red writing on the white hardback. Now, one thing to emphasize that Waterfield emphasizes is that you really have, for Guénon, you have to begin right at the beginning of those works, because the Guénon's personal understanding of Hindu religion is not necessarily foundation, but it runs throughout. So what you find is actually a lot of people begin right at the end. Revolt against the modern world, I think I have it somewhere, and then also the reign of quantity over quality, basically that one as well. And they people take it complete. That whole thing is really a corpus, and I think it seems to me it has to be taken as a whole. So it'd be a lot of reading. Father John Brown, you always comment very nice things on my videos, so thanks very much. Now that you are Catholic, how did observance of Advent strike you? Any insights? I guess, I'm going to have to be honest in the sense of humility with this one. I guess my local parishes, maybe they're more of an older parish, so that's not necessarily tradition, but those aspects of adhering to, whether it's fasts or whatever the things might be in that personal, you go away and you do this thing in the sense of the season, they sometimes take a sort of back role in just keeping the community going, because it's the county that I'm in, Norfolk, is it's a very rural county with a much older population, so I think a lot more is done here just to, unfortunately, sort of keep people going to church and just keep the community alive, so there's I think there's maybe often a step back of like scaring people off with, you should be doing this and that. I don't have too many insights there, but I'm sure more questions about, I think there is a couple of more questions about Catholicism coming up. Cyber, my good friend and mod of the Discord, who I should thank for all his great work over the years now, he asks the very important question: what is the best burger? I probably, like, in terms of consistency of every time I've had it, many people now know that I say exit modernity, but I love McDonald's, and I would say the Big Mac. Like, the Big Mac hits the spot, like a Big Mac and a Coke, that hits the spot every time, unless it's lukewarm. But something about the Big Mac, something about it just hits the spot. There probably wouldn't be, I like raw red onion on a burger, I like pickles on a burger, so yeah, there you go. Thoughts on Jean-Luc Nancy? I haven't read much Jean-Luc Nancy, I'm afraid, so I can't comment there. Good day, James. Enjoy your Q&As. Cheers. Thanks very much. David Mock, can you talk about your peating journey? Any major health changes since you started? The main changes I've had since I've started peating is a greater clarity. The brain fog is lifting, especially when you time the aspirin right. Though I'm not going to condone anyone taking or changing their diet. Like, the Pete episode was about his philosophy, but I do try adhere to a lot of the peating basic dietary principles of, like, not so much Big Macs, but milk and orange juice, but especially the orange juice and the raw carrot salad. I mean, they're like, the raw carrot salad, understand that as a supplement, and you feel amazing afterwards. You feel, it's one of the few things where some people take a supplement and they're like, it just, it alleviated something, but the raw carrot salad, which is just, I grate the carrot on the slice grater of the grater, so it comes out as thin slices. And then you have that, put over some apple cider vinegar just to cover it, and then some salt, and just eat that. One, it's delicious, but two, you feel amazing afterwards. You do feel very refreshed, and I believe the theory is that the long fibers, you have to grate it long, so you keep the long fibers intact, and they brush the excess estrogen out of your system, is the theory, and they also sort of cleanse your gut. And I mean, Pete has this amazing thing about people asking him about depression and some certain mental problems, and he says that maybe a lot of depressions might just be down to a problem in the gut, like a digestive problem. And we're now studying more and more the connections between the gut biome and the mental health, and there's, like, very, very clear connections between them. My major health changes is just, excess in energy, better digestive health, and it's more that perceive, think, act thing of there's no such thing as a diet. So someone might say, go on keto, and then someone goes on keto and they feel awful, but they're like, well, I'll just stick to it because it's said to be healthy. It's like, well, Pete's thing would be like, if you do it and you feel good and you have an excess of energy, then that's what you should stick to. So it's very, very holistic and very subjective. Otherwise you're entering into a dogma of diets, which, and that's the modern mentality of, like, well, we've averaged out the statistics and this is the best thing to do. It's like, well, if you then do that thing and you don't feel good, people will be like, well, I must be wrong. But it's like, well, your body knows the score. Your body doesn't lie. So, that's Pete's mentality. What was Pete's mentality? Yeah. Oh, someone said in America, Peting is eating while sitting on the toilet. I see. Well, I haven't been doing that. It's to do with Ray Pete, the Raymond Pete, the nutritionist who recently passed away. So would you do an episode on Wilden? What's your interest in him? So I'm messaging one person who's very, very interested in Wilden and messaging about the republication of some of his works. And I he clearly knows Wilden's work fairly well, so I asked him if he might, and we're sort of talking about it. I also emailed John Cousins to ask him if he wanted to specifically tackle, because I just think this is his best, the rules are no game. And what I love about this, I mean, this is a philosophy book, right? And you're flicking through, and what's my interest in Wilden is, like, I've never really read anything like it. It's like, why has this been forgotten? This is absolutely sort of astounding, that the just the level of comprehension and research. But then you flick, and right at the end of the book is the schematic for a Lee Enfield rifle. It's fantastic. Corey Anton, I also emailed Corey Anton about the idea of context theory, which Wilden begins at the end of this and then continues through into Man and Woman, War and Peace, which seems to be a progenitor to what a lot of Bateson and et al. Were doing. But I want to try to figure out if context theory was meant to be his own thing that maybe Wilden didn't fully complete, or something along those lines. But who knows? I'm sure there's a lot of history there. So what was the end of that question? My interest in him is simply because I think system and structure is an absolute hidden gem of research and scholarship. It draws in an unfathomable amount of interconnecting things. Are you interested in? Would you consider doing an episode on Thoreau's Walden? I did 2 talks for patrons on Thoreau's Walden, and I found mostly that I focused on the beginning of the book, because there's no point really extrapolating on when he gets into the more poetic writing of his actual living. I was more interested in, he starts talking about economy, and it's really one of the proto books of the idea of exiting modernity, the idea of exit. I haven't read anything much else by Thoreau. There's not tons out there, of course, but maybe I'll find someone. I did email the person who wrote this huge, like 600 plus page biography of Thoreau, but they didn't get back to me, unfortunately. So I'd be interested in doing an overarching episode on Thoreau that actually focused not on as much on Walden, because the other stuff often doesn't even get a look in. Am I involved in any other Catholic groups outside of my parish, given the age difference? I now help teach catechesis, a catechist. I'm not formally done the formal catechism training, but I'm helping teach the few youngsters that we have who are preparing for confirmation. I also do a Bible study once a week, but that's about it. I mean, in this sort of these rural areas, these parts of the world, there isn't as much of a formal community, especially for young people, because it's just, some of these areas are quite literally like 70% people who are 60 plus sort of thing. So it is what it is, but that also has its benefits. You have a very old and usually very pious community who have a lot of wisdom and experience. So there's benefits and negatives, whatever. Just wondering what you make of Przwara, especially in comparison to Stein. Keep up the good work. So I'm going to be recording an episode on Eric Przwara with Philip Gonzalez. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing all of those names correctly. Early next year. We weren't going to record the other day, but there was problems, internet problems. My general feeling with Przwara in relation to Stein, so the big difference between those two is Stein's focus on the subjective person in relation to God, and then Przwara's point that, well, we should be focusing on what comes down, comes from above, what, grace, faith, these things that come from the Lord. And in the sense that Przwara has this sort of, maybe not necessarily a critique, but it is a critique really of Stein's point that, well, maybe if we lean towards this personalism, then the human subject ends up taking the central role and not Christ or God. And I think really Stein's point with that is that all we have as individuals, and this is probably why I adore Stein's work so much, is that all we really have as individuals is what we have, our being, right? You can't address any of these questions except from that point of being, which is why she begins from the phenomenological analysis from Husserl of, we have to go right back to being, right back to basics, and then, begin that reduction and get into what is it we even know at all. And then from that you can approach, that's what you have to approach God. So it's not necessarily putting the human first in that sense, but it's the sense of, well, all we have is what we consider our subjectivity. But the point with that is that objectivity and subjectivity, often used by mainstream news outlets, they're what they tend to mean in contemporary languages. Objective means truth and subjective means opinion. And Stein would really, that's just the way unfortunately the language isn't very helpful. But the point would be that there is this objective truth, and actually the subject is always in relation to the objective. So it doesn't mean it's just an opinion or a bias. It just means it's working its way towards the truth. And Stein is a realist phenomenologist, so her point would be that the objects which are of the phenomena, which we are, are out in the world, they are real, but then they are given to us. So we have to accept them as real, but we also can't just completely occlude our existential judgments of them. So there is a world and it is given. That's almost like an anchor, but then we approach it. Whereas with Husserl, it's just phenomenology, sort of pure phenomenology, which is you don't really have this given world. So they're different. There are differences between that. Their major differences is between, we need to be careful about whether or not we're going to lose God in focusing too much on the subject. What is your thought on Richard Rorty and pragmatism? Like John Dewey or William James haven't spent much time with pragmatism, like at all. John Dewey's a name that comes up. I don't know much about William James. I don't know. I don't have thoughts on it because I just haven't spent much time with it. Thoughts on antinatalism, referring to the philosophical angle, not the millennial hedonist point of view. So the philosophical angle is, that well, as I understand it, that it's better to not have been because there's so much suffering in life that it's better not to have been. Ultimately, for me, I can't see a conclusion that makes any sense for an antinatalist other than suicide, unfortunately. Like, I can't really... Why would you continue to live in such an existence which is so awful when you have the option to opt out? Now, the big problem for me with antinatalism is that whoever told you that life was, going to be... I don't want to say good, life is good, but whoever told you that life isn't going to be full of suffering, that isn't going to be hardships and pains and ups and downs. I mean, where did this idea come from that, like, oh, you're born, so everything just has to be perfect and right? I mean, that's a very modern idea, but mainly because we've probably shoved away suffering so much that when it comes, it's like, no, this can't be, this is an anomaly. Like, whoever sat you down and put this idea into us that life's just meant to be this, like, stream, and pretty much every single mystic of every single... I mean, this is a pretty big comment. I mean, it'd be hard-pressed to find one that isn't, but every religious teaching, even through all the alternative religions and alternative spiritualities that I've researched, Steiner, Gurdjieff, Theosophy, Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, they all have a understanding that growth comes from one's relationship with suffering. If you don't have the bad, you can't understand the good, and that's how you grow, is in relation to what you do with the suffering that you're handed. It's a very cliche comment to make, but I do like the scene at the end of the third Matrix movie, which it's a very good movie generally, but at the end of the third Matrix movie, the architect finally meets with the Neo finally just talks to Agent Smith, I believe, who then is talking as the architect, and he sort of says, like, why did the world have to be this way? And the architect says, we did build it at one point where it was like utopia, it was Eden and ideal, and you just all went mad. Like, you can't really you can't have life without that. And it reminds me of that Twilight Zone episode where the rock and roller guy goes to heaven, and he's in his heaven, which is a casino, and with loads of drinking and smoking and gorgeous women, And, you know, every time he plays the roulette wheel, he wins. Every time he plays poker, he has the best hand, and everyone's like, oh my God, you're the best. Or every time he talks to a woman, they're like howling at his jokes, you know, no hangovers. And this goes on for a couple of months, and he's like, there's no struggle, right? He's winning every time, and everything's great, basically. Everything's perfect. And this goes on for a couple more months, and he's going mad because there's no friction, there's no push. And he goes to the angel who led him to heaven and says, like, what's going on? I thought this was meant to be like heaven. Why am I so miserable and going mad about this? And the angel says to him, like, I never said this was heaven, right? And he's literally in hell. Like, hell for a human being is just no struggle. You can't ground yourself without any struggle or suffering. So, yeah. Thoughts on they're my thoughts on antinatalism. Really, I haven't got much time for it, because it's like, well, okay, I don't know what to do with it after you've said that. I mean, why are you going on to exist? I mean, Schopenhauer maybe didn't go far enough, because he came to fairly bleak conclusions, but then there was some odd things that kept him going, and yet he adhered to asceticism and things. And at the end of the day, if life is so awful, and you would maybe understand that the pleasures of sense were at least somewhat enjoyable, and it's enjoyable to eat delicious food, like, why would you end up being an ascetic like Schopenhauer did? I mean, that never fully made sense to me, but I think that was his almost like his stand, his principle against that. What's the point of reading anything besides the Bible? Well, I'm Catholic, so it's scripture and tradition. I mean, we're not even really officially, we're not obliged to read it as Catholics. I mean, we hear it every week in church, but scripture and tradition. So, you know, I mean, you should be reading other things as well as a Catholic. So, but what's the point? I mean, the point is to explore life and to explore what human beings are doing, and explore what comes from people's investigations of what it is to be alive. Yeah, I mean, it's a strange question in a way, because, I mean, you could probably get certain people who might say, what's the point of reading anything else other than Being and Time, or whatever their book is, and it's ultimately, well, to explore life, to examine it. You know, it's fun, it's interesting. Sorry, I missed one there. Thoughts on Karl Marx. I'm not being condescending, genuinely interested. There's not a lot of materialist social analysis on this channel. I'm obviously not a Marxist, but I'm happy to do episodes on Marx. Marxism interests me, of course it does. It's this huge thing. I guess the reason for me that maybe there hasn't been so much on Karl Marx is usually people who use Marx have now use it in a form of leftist politics, which just doesn't personally interest me. So it's not in the sense that if I spoke to people about these types of politics that I would be like condescending and being like, that's wrong. It just doesn't interest me, so I wouldn't have much enthusiasm about the conversation. In terms of, I'm not even going to say whether, I never really say on the podcast whether or not the person, I agree with the person I'm talking to, whether I consider it morally right or morally wrong, or philosophically right or wrong. I'm interested in ideas, but when the ideas don't interest me, which most of leftist politics doesn't, modern leftist politics doesn't, you know, it's not going to be a very good conversation. But in terms of like Marx, and I'm really interested in the moment, though I haven't read too much around it, but I've been thinking about it a lot. It's like, what happened to Althusser? Like, I want to talk to like a modern Althusserian and be like, what's going on? Because Althusser was this huge figure, and obviously then he went mad, and et cetera, et cetera. So whether or not that was the downfall, but I sort of want to just see, like, I'm really interested in why philosophers who were once literally the biggest thing just fall off. So, but I'd be happy to do episodes on Marx, sure, but it's about finding someone who maybe, you know, I almost like want to talk to a Marxist I want to talk to someone about Karl Marx who isn't a Marxist maybe, and just look at these texts. I mean, I'd be happy to talk about Grundrisse. You know, Land has these, Land draws on Grundrisse in some of his work in a very interesting way. I wouldn't mind talking about the theory of like eventually capitalism will break, and what the maybe the general Marxist sentiment around that is now. It's more a case of finding the right people. Views on monarchy. Have I watched the Prince Harry Netflix series? The notion outside of the UK that we in the UK live under a monarchy has been dumbfounded since post World War II. This is a monarchy in the sense of tourism. it's an aesthetic. And people say, oh, well, the Queen has to sign off the laws, and well, she did have to sign off the laws, and the King now has to sign off the laws. I don't really, no one in the UK is. I don't really see anyone in the UK as the thing, except would even entertain the idea that we live under a monarchy. But in terms of my views on monarchy, I think it's one of the most politically consistent and stable forms of government you can have. I don't really believe in a political solution, which I was going to get to in one of the other questions, but it would be my preferred mode of existence. And once again, the problem with a lot of people thinking about monarchy is when we had monarchy, we didn't have the technological innovation that we had now. So people think, well, people do that general problem of conflating a political form, which was in the past, with all the other things that were in the past. So they think about monarchy and they think, oh, well, we're going to be serfs in the fields again. Well, that's not how it's going to work, right? It's like monarchy isn't the thing that caused, dysentery in those times, right? It was an issue of hygiene, not monarchy. Maybe some theorists could dunk on me on that, but it would be my preferred. The seemingly paradoxical idea of anarcho-monarchism would be my preferred mode of governance, in the sense that individual citizens of a realm have as much personal freedom under a free market as really is possible. But at the end of the day, I can't go the whole hog with like the libertarian thing, that because to a certain degree that I think there does have to be this backbone of some type of governance. And I see that especially Hans Hermann Hoppe's writing around, a monarch king, you realize why it is they can't start just taxing their citizens tons, and they do have to care about their land, and etc. etc. They actually have this not sunk cost, but an investment in it in a personal level, which is much more important. So yeah, I'm sympathetic to monarchy. What is your thought on analytical philosophers like Wittgenstein, Frege, Russell, or Davidson? Haven't spent a ton of time with Russell, none with Davidson, and none with Frege, but I adore Wittgenstein, and it's very difficult to talk about Wittgenstein because what are we talking about? I mean, I spent some time with the Tractatus, and of course I did the episode with Miles Hollingsworth, and really I adored that book because that was how I'd thought about Wittgenstein, but didn't really have anywhere close of the articulation of Hollingsworth to be able to put it down on paper. And so I saw him more as that kind of figure, as that his struggles in the terms of defining things, of trying to get to the truth of the matter, wasn't this like solely like abstract philosophical thing, but it really was at the end of the day for man, for there was a part of care in that. But yeah. Looking forward to the Albert Schweitzer interview. Yep, I'm very pleased with it. It was very good. I followed David Harvey's lectures series on Capital a few years ago while reading the text. Found it absolutely fascinating. See, now, when I was trying to get into Das Kapital, Karl Marx's Capital, years ago now, I remember, putting out the feelers of like, okay, what can I be reading around this to sort of help me? And someone, like one person mentions David Harvey, right? And then the next comment is, you can't be serious, So you immediately get into what is often a very left-wing problem of someone mentions a thinker and they say, well, you read this alongside, it's a really good commentary. And someone says, no, they absolutely obscure the point. And so I'd like to read David Harvey, but a lot of people also don't take David Harvey very seriously in Marxist circles. That was my understanding. But he's sort of the most well-known commentary on Capital. So this question also got asked in the Discord as well and the Patreon. Who are the three thinkers I would like to put in a room? At the moment, it is still George Gurdjieff. It would be George Gurdjieff, Ernst Jünger, and Edith Stein. Be a very intense room because one, I would be in front of a saint, which would be very... I don't know what I'd really do. And then, of course, Gurdjieff is very intense, and so is Jünger. So it would be fairly potent and room full of presence. It'd be an interesting room as well. Jung and Gurdjieff most certainly met, and of course Jung being a Nazi who was critical of Nazism, and then Stein, of course, being killed in Auschwitz. I mean, I think it would be an important conversation. And Jung at the end of his life converting to Catholicism, being in front of this Catholic saint who died sort of under the regime that he was in. I think it would be a fascinating conversation. Would I ever have Paul Kingsnorth back on Hermetics? I emailed Paul about possibly doing a Christmas special, but I'm sure he's extremely busy. But I'd love to have him back on, yeah. Am I interested in any of Kierkegaard's ideas, despite his Protestantism? Well, from my understanding, I mean, I'm not sure we can... I don't know too much here, but I don't think... Can we consider Kierkegaard a Protestant? From my understanding, that he was just a sort of a free Christian by the end of it all. That might be wrong. I tried to read Kierkegaard the other day. I tried to read, everyone says start with Fear and Trembling, and I went into this with the impression that Kierkegaard was this existential poet, and it was some of the most dense rubbish writing I'd ever read. So unless I've got a bad translation, I couldn't really make heads or tails of it. I mean, the idea of Kierkegaard's that I generally turn to a lot is the leap of faith, and I agree with it. You can read and research your faith and do many different things and get up to like what I'd say is 95% faith, but there is this point of you got to take the leap. You got to have faith. That's what faith is. So that idea will always be a mainstay in a way. Someone asked about Guénon. I've been looking for, basically long short of Guénon is, I've been looking for a long time for someone to talk about Guénon with, and I've yet to find anyone. Thoughts on All the Pretty Horses? Haven't read the other two books in the Border trilogy. I mean, it's McCarthy. He really is my favorite author. Fiction wise, he is my favorite author. I can't see how someone can write that well and that beautifully. It's astounding to me. My thoughts on All the Pretty Horses is that I would maybe now say start there. The prison section is this sudden lurch into just this other realm of absolutely destitute and base consciousness of man. This basically just enters into this hell of... and it makes me think, I mean, McCarthy... I was talking to Cyber actually about this in the Discord, about McCarthy he doesn't do fictional stuff. He researches meticulously his books. So this prison would have been, as I understand it, would have been a real articulation of what the prison would have been like. And it really is just an old sort of fort in the middle of the desert. And all it is the people who are arrested, you just put them in there. And these are the worst of the most illiterate, foul human beings. And the two young men, Grady and Rawlins, in the book at that point, it's just every day got up and got the crap beat out of them, and then eating some beans on a dry tortilla, and it's absolutely awful. But it's at the same time, he just imbues it with such beauty that the nature takes precedence over any of this, and in his work, suffering becomes something much more. And then you go through to Stella Maris and The Passenger, and boy oh boy. But yeah, would you consider doing a crossover or collab episode with Novara Media? Always seeing the same people on your comments and intrigued by this. Thank you. I mean, Novara Media are much bigger than me, and I don't know what a crossover really would be about. Maybe about like capitalist realism and accelerationist politics. I'm happy to talk to anyone. I've said, someone messaged me the other day. They had a very small podcast and said like, would you I know we're a small podcast, but would you consider coming on? And I just said like, I don't really mind. As long as people are kind, I'm happy to talk to anyone about interesting ideas. That's all I really care about. As long as people are, very English sentiment, I guess. As long as people are cordial or kind, then yeah. What is my thought of Jacques Derrida? It's funny you say that. I'm very, very close to finishing it, and I think it's fantastic. An event, perhaps, biography of Jacques Derrida by Peter Salmon, which is a brilliant little link, because I just didn't have a full grip of Derrida, and I can't disagree with him. I think ultimately he's extremely important. I mean, and also he's one of the most misconstrued thinkers. I mean, I don't think he wasn't going into this in the sense of, and he even makes this clear very early on, he wasn't going into this in the sense of destruction. He's just making clear evident things about how we read and interrogate texts as subjects. You take in your own context with you, and so deconstruction is almost default. You know, look at the history of Bible commentary, and you see that Derrida's been proven right the whole time. But yeah, and I need to get to grips with. The only thing I've read is the infamous essay that he gave, structure, sign structure, whatever that one is. Yeah. But other than that, at the moment, my just from Salmon's book, I'm mostly in agreement. He's an exciting writer. In regard to Marx, would you check out Ian Wright, in particular, Capital is a Real God? Harvey I would recommend, but for some reason he disavows Marx's labour theory of value, which is slightly odd. Yeah, so we're already getting into the dirt of left-wing and Marxist political theory, right? Of like, well, this person got it wrong, that person got it right. But I'll check out Capital as a Real God. Yeah, the one person I'd love to interview is the guy who wrote the book about capitalism and mammon. It's a huge book. Did Gurdjieff ever practice a mainstream religion? Gurdjieff was a Russian Orthodox, and by all accounts, by the end, he had a bit more to do with the local Russian Orthodox church near him, and there is a church in Paris that every year still has a mass for Gurdjieff. So I would say that he practiced a lot of different things, but I'd say orthodoxy. You could read Joseph Azizi's book on this. He draws in the Athos tradition into Gurdjieff and makes it clear, especially Saint Simeon from the Philokalia. His writings, especially on the text on sobriety by Saint Simeon, is clearly Gurdjieff was very influenced by this. Where he found it, or in what sense he understood it, or where he got it from, we don't know. But there's certainly influence there. What are my top 3 fiction writers? McCarthy, obviously, but who are the other 2? So yeah, Cormac McCarthy's top. David Foster Wallace would be there. John Williams, especially Stoner. And, well, if we put him in it, because I think we have to put him in it, Émile Chiron. Because he's an aphorist, right? But if we're talking, I'll stick to the question. If we're talking fiction, I always just forget everything I've ever read. I mean, Ernst Junger's fiction's very good, but in terms of, Nabokov as well. I love prose. I'm not one really for too much function. I'd rather go, if I want function in a book, I'll just go read the textbook I'll go read my car manual if I want to just know what the measurements of things are, and this person went into this room and then did this. Well, fine, just tell me the end of the story now if it's all about function. I'm more about prose and form and aesthetics over pretty much everything. Otherwise it doesn't really interest me all that much. So I would throw in there McCarthy, Nabokov, Foster Wallace. I like all the American postmodernists. DeLillo. Oh, actually, I'm not huge on Pynchon, to be fair. He's fine, but someone mentioned this the other day, and I agreed with them that he's become outdated. The references are all a bit. We've gone a bit past the sort of 60s current now. Thanks for having Paul Bishop on regarding Ludwig Klages. No worries, thank you. It helped me to read Husserl under Standards and to go back to Husserl, back to them, back and forth. Now I actually get... so there's the 2 books that really helped for me on Husserl is Zahavi's Husserl's Phenomenology, very short, splits Husserl into 3 eras. It's honestly like 150 pages. You get a good chunk of Husserl and you understand him very quickly. And there's also just a book called Husserl by... It might be Dermot Morin. It might be Morin who wrote the one of those Introduction to Phenomenology books, which is really, really good as well, and that's by Routledge. I like Husserl, though. I would like to try and find a Husserl biography, but I'm not sure if there's been sort of a big one written. Thoughts on Gnosticism in relation to McCarthy? Whether or not he is a Gnostic himself, I don't want to comment, but there's huge Gnostic elements. He's always mentioning djinns, those Islamic demons. People think that the idea of a djinn comes in actually in All the Pretty Horses, comes in very early in his work, and he carries that idea all the way through. And then if you've read his latest novels, which I can't really spoil them, but there's no spoilers here. There's this mention of the thing called the Archatron, which is like the guardian of a gate, and beyond it, actually, there's this idea that this life's fairly bad, but when we die, much worse is coming. And there's Gnostic elements there. Personally, I'm not sure. He maybe is a practicing Catholic. I don't know. But, he grew up, I believe, in a Catholic household, and the Catholicism is imbued within his work, but whether or not he practices now, I don't know. He says he's pretty much a materialist. Don't know about that. So back to the other questions. So keep the questions coming. Back to the other questions from the Discord and the Patreon. What idea, belief, do you think is the most dangerous to a society? Idea or belief? Well, the myth of progress is extremely dangerous. The myth that we're forever going forward and everything's going to be better without any real coherent end that progress is targeted towards. Extremely dangerous. I mean, I'm trying to think. The problem is, what do people believe now? I mean, the problem is now we have what we deem as a lack of belief. We're in the era of the hegemony of anti-hegemony, which is the most dangerous one because you don't. So there's a dangerous idea or belief, is the idea that you've somehow got outside of constrained hegemonic thinking, right? Oh, look, we can see modernism, we can see fascism, we can see all these isms. So we, in this era, which is post-ism, I'm not going to say postmodernism, but like post-ism, post-hegemonic thinking, we must be outside of it. But that itself has become a hegemony where nothing is allowed to grow, but that hegemony is still there, and we keep denying it. And Husserl, going back to Husserl, he's basically, I think he puts this brilliantly early in volume 1 of the Logical Investigations. He basically says any theory which can begin by allowing relativism negates its possibility of ever being a coherent theory. So, like, the anti-hegemony is like a hegemony which can never be. So we're stuck in this, like, just whirring at the moment, and nothing can be planted. And I don't really know what it's going to take. Somehow, some weird form of vitalism, or I don't know, for someone to just launch a flag down and say, like, can you just piss off with this relativist stuff? Here's an anchor. Because you can't move anywhere if you don't have that. You can't do anything. It's very difficult. Yeah, idea and belief, dangerous society. It's a society. It's a lot. Whatever's making what we have now. I mean, it's more of a lack of ideas and beliefs, which are really what we have now. I mean, we see this in the sense of, the new Canadian healthcare stuff. In like, well, someone's really, really unwell and in pain, and they can't really consent to anything, so we're just going to kill them. And it's like, well, without any lacks, when you completely lack all these ideas and beliefs regarding sanctity of human life, people become just productive vessels for production. And ultimately, once you become unproductive and you can't just produce for yourself in the sense that you don't need the state, once you need the state and you can't produce, well, I'm just going to kill you. That seems to be the way we're going. Someone said, do I read poetry as well as prose? I really like Tolkien's poetry, especially the Tom Bombadil poetry. I think Tolkien's poetry is often overlooked because it's scattered throughout his books, and especially and his songs as well. I think he's almost like underappreciated as a poet because we think of him as a novelist. But I also like a lot of the more, fairly popular poets that I like. But Philip Larkin is one I like. Seamus Heaney. Yeah. Other than that, I've never really sat down and read a book of poetry. There's a few that I'd like to get through, but never, not as big into poetry as I am in prose. How is my peat journey going? What's my current diet like? My current diet is the one I posted to Twitter. So I drink orange, like maybe half a liter of orange juice and half a liter of whole milk every day, and I have maybe 3 coffees with cream and sugar. and then I'll have the carrot salad about 3 times a week. I don't eat that every day. And then I make sure I have liver about twice a week, actually. And then other than that, I'll eat like potato, beef, raw veg like cucumber. I eat mushrooms, anything aromatase inhibitors, and anything that's decreasing the estrogen, basically in the system, and increasing body heat is important. Yeah, it's a pretty basic diet, really, and it's very, very affordable. Favorite painters from 15th century onwards, 1 or 2 from each century. I'm terrible with dates, so I can't give you that. I can give you favorite painters. They're mostly modern. Gerhard Richter is my favorite painter. I like Clifford Still, who was one of the underappreciated abstract expressionists. I like Ad Reinhardt, who painted these beautiful black paintings. I like Malevich and the suprematist movement. I like I like people who paint massive black paintings, basically, that are very bleak. Yeah, and then at the moment I'm really into Frederick Remington. He's probably my favorite painter at the moment. This brilliant Old West painter. That's because I've been reading too much McCarthy. Yeah. Right. So after that was a big question. How do I view electricity, keeping in mind its role in technological growth and the teaching of Valentin Tomberg? Leaving aside the psychic and mental aspects of electricity, how do you view the physical aspect? For example, do I make any attempt to minimize my use of electricity? I don't have any electrical things in my bedroom at all, and I now leave even my phone, which is now just a flip phone, which I haven't gone back to my smartphone. I don't think I ever will, but I don't have any electrical devices in my bedroom, and I don't, I'm sat in front of the computer all day. But the main thing I would try and minimize, so like this is wired. I don't really like Wi-Fi. I don't have a microwave. Anything with waves, I'm not huge on. And like if I'm not using something, it's switched off at the wall and unplugged because, yeah. As far as my own understanding of electricity in maybe the alternative senses, I would go read Arthur Furstenberger's. I think so. I've either Arthur, and it's definitely Arthur, but it's Furstenberg or Furstenberger. His book, The Invisible Rainbow, which is incredibly well researched point about how each cyclic iteration of a big innovation in universal or global electricity use. So like here's telegraph poles, the telegram, here's the radio, here's TV, here's 4G, whatever it might be. Every single time this has happened, there is a spike in illness cases, specifically flu, and these cases aren't constrained in the sense that would adhere to any idea of germ theory. So like people are getting flu spontaneously in places which are often completely outside of any bounds. So like people, there's one instance where the Navy on a Navy ship are getting the flu at the same time people inland, however many miles away it is, are getting the flu, and it's due to for Furstenberg, it's due to an iteration of electricity. And I mean, that book, it sounds ridiculous, but there's almost like 150 pages of referencing, and at the end of the day, that's what the scientific method is. And if you read it and it's well researched and the evidence is there, then go see it. But in terms of, I mean, what we should be quick to not ignore, because sometimes when we think of electricity, we think of it as like the thing that powers this screen and allows the pixels to light up and allows the electrical appliance. I mean, we're full of electricity. Our brain is electrical, right? Like there is this thing called electricity, which is very peculiar. So it's always good to think about it in those terms as well. Someone asked me this, and I don't actually know what they mean in this context. Someone said, have I ever gotten filtered by a book? So if someone could explain to me what getting filtered by something means. I hope I'm not being ignorant with that, but I did look it up, but I didn't really understand what it means. I think there's a social meaning for it. So someone asks, and I like this question actually, what do I think the future of philosophy is as a field? Will online creators continue to become more relevant and supplant traditional academics? Or will academia still remain dominant in terms of defining the field for the foreseeable future? The future of philosophy, I mean, philosophy is always going to be around because people are always going to be thinking about, we're existential beings. We're always going to be questioning things. As far as the main question there of like, what's the ongoing dialogue going to be like between creators and academia writ large? It's a difficult one because what we would call the legitimacy of being like a well-known or knowledgeable scholar or philosopher is still reliant on the credentials which are supplied to us by academia. So when you see people who are doing these autodidactic courses, like I've done a couple online, usually the biography of the person who's giving it says, I have a PhD or an MA in this or that thing. So like there's still this reliance on this person knows what they're on about because of the credential. So what maybe would be the future is that universities, as they are at the moment, basically become these businesses just for getting someone the little tick on the box to say you have these letters at the end of your name, and then that allows someone to go off and do their own practice. And that seems to be happening in the medical profession as well. Someone gets a license and then they go run a holistic practice, or someone gets like a counseling license and then they go, that allows them to go perform an alternative form of counseling that they found more effective than CBT or whatever, right? So maybe I would say that that's going to happen, because ultimately, when it comes to philosophy, as it comes to social sciences as well, a lot of people are realizing that the money that you're spending on a university education isn't going to pay off in terms of getting a job and getting an income in the world. But the people who want to do these degrees are still interested in the subjects, and they want to learn them in a formal, rigorous sense from someone who knows what they're on about. So the in-between of that is, instead of spending £9,000 for the year on what is usually 2 modules at a university, or 2 or 3, maybe 4 modules at a university for the year for £9,000, you spend money on an autodidactic course online with a tutor, and the course seems expensive because it's like £1,000 for, I don't know, 10 lectures, but you're learning exactly what you want to learn in a rigorous way with a tutor, and you're not in debt, and it's more, you just want to learn it for the sake of it. And in a way, it's a healthier attitude towards philosophy, I think. And you also learn what you want to learn, and it also gives, for me, what I like about that is it gives a lot of opening for, strange courses again. People aren't going to be, you can go, right, I'm going to go do a course on Ludwig Klages, or I'm going to go do a course on Gurdjieff, or whatever, right? That for me is extremely positive aspect. As for the academy itself, I mean, you could just look around. I mean, philosophy courses, big ones, are closing down. They either don't have, they're not getting the funding anymore, or whatever it might be. I mean, it's just unfortunate, but if that's the way it is, that's the way it is. So they also said, is there any historical analogies here? As universities are, of course, a fairly recent thing, while philosophy is. Universities are a recent thing, but the academy is as old as what we in the West would consider philosophy, right? You have Plato begins with the academy. There's always been formal schools of philosophy, and maybe in a way we need to move back to that, of people who truly believe in something, so they go to the master and spend time under him. That would be great. 2, any recommendations or preferences on aesthetics, especially contemporary thinkers that focus on religion or technology? Yeah, Lewis Mumford's good. That would be, especially on technology. Aesthetics, I don't read aesthetics very much. I've always been just way more into, my philosophical scope when it comes to like genuine interest has always been like huge things, like how do we know what we know, and if aesthetics comes into that, then it's always in relation to how do we know what we know, or something like that, right? Like epistemology, metaphysics, those are the big things for me, like God as well, of course. Someone asks, they're curious if I've ever read Aleister Crowley's book on the tarot. What are my thoughts on his tarot? I haven't read it, so I can't give you thoughts. And then they also had a follow-up question. They feel like most dysfunction in society is solved with inward work, but what are the problems of narcissism in that idea, or is it right? How is the tension solved? Well, Christopher Lasch, of course, in the culture of narcissism, puts forward that everyone's becoming more narcissistic. The problem, of course, with narcissism in relation to the inner work is that for inner work you have to know yourself, as the oracles of Delphi would say, right? You have to know thyself. And the problem is if thyself has created such a strong mask which it believes it knows itself, then all you're ever looking into is an artificial self, and that's never going to go anywhere, and you just end up self-justifying what it is you're doing and being like, oh, I knew I was right all along. How is the tension of narcissism solved? I mean, it's the question which has plagued psychologists and psychoanalysts basically since the beginning is, how do you treat someone who believes, who has grown up in such a way or has developed in such a way that every part of their being and every part of their psychology tells them that the insane way, quite literally, that they are living is sane, right? Because you're trying to prove to someone that they're not sane, and if all of their mechanisms have told them that they are. And this is a big problem of, I was reading Alexander Lowen recently about this, and he's saying that as the narcissistic tendencies of society sort of accelerate, you end up into that Krishnamurti quote of you're becoming conditioned to an unhealthy society, so you become unhealthy. So eventually you have a world where everyone is narcissistic is a world where everyone is insane, but the last sane person seems insane. Their kindness, their genuine empathy, their genuine charity, their genuine humility appears as, from the view of a narcissist, as a controlled false act, and it's very difficult to untangle that. I mean, the book just called Narcissism by Alexander Lowen's really good, and of course Christopher Lash's book on narcissism is two great starting places on that. What is your thought of John Searle and the discipline of the philosophy of mind? I haven't read Searle, I'm afraid. As for philosophy of mind, it's one of those things where, as a continental, I'm like, well, let's just get back to Kant. Let's get back to brass tacks if we're talking about mind. Let's get back to Husserl. Let's make sure we avoid psychologism and take these things seriously. That would be, where I would begin. Any thoughts on Matthias Desmet's mass formation psychosis? I haven't read Desmet, but in terms of mass formation psychosis, I've got an episode coming up with, once again, with Maurizio Loza, and we touch on mass formation psychosis and mass formations in general, and masses in general, and I think it's a definite thing. The thing to remember is there isn't technically any such thing as a mob. Everyone is still an individual, but as those things grind on, there appears to be such a thing as a mob. But as Ernst Junger points out, everyone becomes an individual again when you start firing a machine gun at them, right? When you fire a machine gun at the mob, reality comes back and bites you, and it's very easy to get pulled up in the swing of a mob, but a conscious shock will send you out of that very quickly, and then people have that moment of oh, actually, what do I actually really believe? Am I really in this? Yeah, it's difficult. I grew up secular, but never have been atheistic. Lately, I find myself having a new but fluctuating faith in God. How can one nurture the fledgling faith? Don't put too much pressure on yourself, especially early on. When you start reading all these, as many people do, they'll jump in heavy, and they'll read everything and anything. And that you start coming across ascetics and saints and these people who've gone the whole way. They're living in the woods or whatever it might be, or something like that. And one thing to remember is that's a calling, that's a vocation. That will come, that's providence. It will come whether or not it arrives or not. One thing to think early on with a fledgling faith is to realize, I think, that some people, and this is my own understanding, but it's helped me a lot. Whether or not it's true or not, I mean, maybe a priest will listen and email me and say, James, what are you doing? But one big mistake I made early on was you suddenly have this thing of sin and badness which is in front of you, and you start to realize things about yourself, about how you've acted, that, man, I'm in the words of the church, like a worm, and I'm now trying to be better. Now, this is the mistake I made, was, like I said, you read all these great saints, these great Christians or Catholics or people of the church, and you realize they've done all this good. And what the mistake I made was I tried to imitate that too early on, in the sense that almost like from a separate self. was like, right, I'm now going to go be that. And then when I failed at that, that was where I saw the mercy of God or the mercy of Christ, was when I failed at that. But in time, after now, 2 years and then almost 1 year of being Catholic, in time I realized that Christ's mercy is just for you were made the way you are, and that doesn't mean not trying to get better and trying to progress spiritually and trying to spiritually grow and become a more moral person. But the mercy that Christ has for you is because you are fallible, is because you're imperfect. You don't try to become perfect, and then the mercy is when you fail at that. You are imperfect, and the mercy is for when you fall in that sense. And some advice I've been given is some people really beat themselves up about when they fall, and they're like, well, I've fallen and that's not where the mercy is, I'm just an idiot, blah blah, I'm a moron. The mercy is found in how often again and how quickly you can get back up and go, you know what, I'm not perfect, I'm fallen, this is part and parcel of what it is to be human, I'm going to get back up again and I'm going to keep trying. And that is where faith is found in. That's really where mercy, the acceptance and understanding of mercy is found. It's not, oh, I failed at some big grand gesture of charity and humility or whatever it might be that you think, which can become prideful in itself. It's, I'm a fallen human, I'm not perfect, but I'm going to keep trying. I fell again. You go confess, you see yourself for yourself as you confess, you see what you've done and how you are right in front of you. And you go, I'm going to pull myself back up and I'm just going to get on again. I'm going to get back up. That would be my advice for the faith. Of course, personal prayer is extremely important. I'm not big for prayers of rote, da 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 every night. I can't really do that. I'm much more prayer while I walk, prayer when I'm like, my heart's telling me to say a prayer for whatever it is. As Saint Teresa of Avila says, God is among the pots and pans. It's not, he's in the mass, he's in the church, but he's also among the pots and pans. And it's like making your life a prayer and trying to remember God as much as you can is prayer in itself. So don't be too hard on yourself, because anything that is given by grace and will be there if you open yourself to it. So don't like, you see people praying and they're like tensing up, like trying to send a prayer out of the tops of their fingertips or something. It's like, just allow it. Like, God's mercy is there for who you are already, right? And to accept that is to then open yourself up to a much deeper and more humble and honest form of, this is who I am and I'll try to get better here, instead of like this imitation. It's imitating Christ, but from where you are and accepting that forthwith. Where was the next one? Someone again asked here, what's my answer to the Hermetics question? I've already answered that. Someone said, I recently became Catholic after being a quite obnoxious atheist for a long time. What have been the most interesting responses to your conversion, positive or negative? Do you think there's a new openness to the religion among intellectuals, even as secularization continues? Or is that just wishful thinking, the view from the bubble? In terms of responses to my conversion, of course you have people who are like, oh, he's become Tradcath, what will it be next? Fine, I'm not here to... I'm actually not here as a missionary. I don't think I was an atheist, right? So I know, as C.S. Lewis says, the door from hell is closed from the inside, right? And if someone has closed that door to God from the inside, me pushing on it is not going to do any good until they even just, oh, what is that, right? Until they do that, you can't arm wrestle someone to Christ, unfortunately, because it's not faith in that sense. So, I'm not massively interested in that aspect in it in a way. But in people's responses to it, I mean, I think a lot of people just sort of maybe shy away a little bit because it's like, it's a big thing. They don't really get why someone would do it. A lot of people knew me before in IRL as a sort of, as I said before, a militant atheist for my young life. So there it was a bit like, oh, but most people are just happy for you. And I think some people are maybe a bit like concerned in the sense of that makes them think about what you suddenly say, I've started going to church, I've started praying. I mean, ultimately some of the first thoughts of what to think about, what one thinks about and connects to God is death. Oh, where are we going? What am I doing? So I think for a lot of people, it's almost like asking a big existential question, and they're like, oh, I don't really know what to do with this. So, and at the end of the day, Christ is unconditionally merciful. So that's what you got to remember. And also, do I think there's a new openness to religion from intellectuals? Yeah, I do. But my worry is that the openness comes from, once again, something I spoke about with Esme Partridge when we did the podcast on mysticism and modernity a while back, about this idea of sort of bracketing off religion, and we'll draw in religious tradition as a socio-cultural artifact. So it's like, oh, I'm open to religion, but I'm going to take it seriously only in an intellectual academic sense, which inherently removes the conditions which make it what it is altogether, right? You can't talk about religion without accepting that people who are talking about religion have a sincere faith in God. So some people are open to it only on that intellectual academic level, which I think is destructive. I think it's very, very destructive, and I'd rather they just went away. Do I think there's an openness to it? I think the openness to it isn't necessarily from intellectuals. I think it's from maybe an intellectual culture which has hit so many dead ends over and over and over again because of relativism, that people are, they're performing the Augustinian retreat to God. Return to God. Whoops, we went down this road, it didn't work out. Yeah, this is really bad and dumb. And I can understand what faith and warmth and love are now from this position. Once again, you get through suffering, you experience horrible sufferings and death and things like that, or the death of culture, and you experience the existential nihilism of the world, and you go, yeah, that's not a good place to be. Let's head on back. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's not weak. That takes a strength. It takes a courage. Let me tell you. And then someone says, thoughts on attempts to construct a Catholic politics, distribution, integralism. I don't know much about integralism, and I literally have a surface level understanding of distributism. And from my surface level understanding of it, I'm not for it, actually, because I believe in I still believe in personal liberty and religious freedoms. So in the sense that if you had a theocracy in the sense of the Catholic government, what would be a Catholic government distributes property. That property is no longer private, and I'm a firm believer in private property. So I'm not for it in that sense of, even though I'm Catholic, there's plenty of people who aren't, and I don't feel it right that just because I agree with the government, I'll go, oh right, you don't really have private property, and it's not going to be distributed to you because of whatever. I may have got that wrong, but I'm much more on the side of there is no political solution. Find the good way you can, find faith where you can. There's good people out there, there's humility out there, there's kindness out there. Find that where you can, but there's no political solution. It's cycles. You look at any cycle, you look at Kondratiev waves, as I am at the moment, K waves, and you realize everything just goes up and down, up and down. Humans aren't all that smart, really. We go back and forward, and then the people who are at the peak think that the thing we need to get to is the bottom of the peak, and then the people who are then born, we're not very good at passing on information, basically. And once you sort of, I did like Cormac McCarthy in that interview. He says, yeah, I'm pessimistic about the world, but that doesn't mean I have to be fucking miserable. And I would say that's pretty much where I'm at. I'm pessimistic about things, but I'm having a good time. It's all pretty good. At the end of the day, it's like, things are collapsing. People aren't really interested in big questions anymore. The family units are collapsing. Birth rates are down, fertility rates are down. All these oil prices are going through the roof. We're closing in on peak oil. All these horrible things. You can go, yeah, they're happening, but they're not on my doorstep just yet. And we can do things. And in a very naive way, I'd say, yeah, but I'm about to have my dinner, and that's going to be right now. That's going to be pretty tasty. And to think any other way, you're entering into a madness which is very egotistical. As if you're going to step outside and be like, right, I'm going to sort out peak oil, or I'm going to just slow down. Who are you? There's no political solution, but that doesn't have to get you down. There's good stuff in the world, Do I indulge in regular meditation? Any experiences, if so? I used to do the Gurdjieff morning preparation every morning, which was just sit in a meditative position with your eyes closed and focus on the feeling in your feet. And I found that one probably the most helpful one I've done. It just gives you, it sets you up for the day, makes you calmer, makes you more productive in the sense that you don't procrastinate as much. And occasionally, you know, I fall in and out of meditation because it's sort of not the thing for the Western mind, unfortunately. But yeah, so keep the questions coming, and I'll answer whatever's asked. Thoughts on Oswald Spengler, Oswald Spengler, The Ancient City, and other works that suggest a time limit on our culture. Does Western civilization dying mean the death of Christianity as well? Well, Christianity is not just in Western civilization; it's all over there. It's over the whole globe. It's very difficult because civilization has become to be understood in a very material sense. When we think of civilization, well, at least and I think many people would think of skyscrapers, complex systems. It's a very material thing. Christianity is an internal thing. It's in the heart, and it's also the kingdom of God, which is above. So in the sense that, the civilization, which is really just the means to be able to have the material things for the rituals of Christianity, isn't really, if one or two are there together, then I am there in spirit. That's the church. You don't need all this stuff to practice it. So the death of Christianity will be when, the last heartfelt believer in Christ dies. That would be the death of Christianity. And in the sense that the Orthodox talk about how, monastics pray for the world. Well, I like to think, well, that means that when the last monastery falls, that will be when the world ends, right? Yeah. So, the death of civilization won't mean the death of Christianity. Christianity did fairly well at times without civilization. Modified Hamidics question. If I had to choose 3 Hamidics guests to place in a room and listen to the conversation, who would they be? It would be John Michael Greer, Abdul Hakim Murad, and maybe, yeah, John Michael Greer, Abdul Hakim Murad, and maybe like Paul Kingsnorth or something. Put a Christian in there as well. So it's people who have a very expansive understanding of the limits of modernity in relation to tradition and religion. I think it would be an absolutely fascinating conversation. How do I think David Foster Wallace's thought would have evolved were he still alive? Also, were you aware he was interested in converting and apparently attended RCIA twice? How do I think it would have evolved? I think Pale King would have been an absolute masterpiece. Not that it isn't already. But it might have almost become like a parody of itself in a way that he might have struggled to know what to do with it. Because this the world we're in now is just an acceleration of what was going on in Infinite Jest to the nth degree. So the point after that is well, where do you go from it? But it would have been nice to see him develop the idea of post irony and sincerity more. We need that now. I was aware that he had a fairly seemingly strong Christian conviction, but I think he really struggled to see that in the face of, his modern attitude towards things and yeah. Been a while since I've read any, but I've read everything he's written. So I guess, as there's no questions in the chat, I'll wait for anyone to ask any more. One thing I should say is, of course, if you've enjoyed the podcast this year, please think about supporting, because a small amount of money does go a very long way. Thank you all, of course, for supporting. Thanks to my paying patrons very much for keeping everything going. And just thanks for all the support. The answer to the fiction question was Nabokov, John Williams, and then David Foster Wallace. Yeah. Trying to think. There is some There is some Christmas specials that will be coming up, though I'm not going to put them as a premiere, so they're a surprise on the day. So there's a few Christmas specials coming up, and then I've got content all the way through to the new year. But yeah, other than that, this has been fun, and I'll give it a couple of minutes to see if there's any more questions. Doesn't look to be. Well, thanks everyone for tuning into the Q&A. These are always very fun. And I hope you all have a very Merry Christmas. And